Hey everybody, welcome back to Race of History. Today we're about to get into the Western Front part of the Eastory series for World War II. Before we get started, a couple of things. One, my heart goes out to everybody. There has been a string of tornadoes in the South U.S. Brutal, brutal. If you're not from the States or from a region that has tornadoes, they're extremely dangerous. They can lead to, just a ton of destruction in everything that they touch. I've actually seen one in my lifetime. I live in an area where they're not common, but they're much more common than in other places of the world. I've been in many tornado warnings and have been in areas where tornadoes have touched down in the vicinity, within like a 10, 20 mile radius. So, big deal with the string of tornadoes. And my heart goes out to all of you guys if you guys have been affected by it. Also, I'm going to release later my first video from the World War II series, the Week by Week channel from Indy and Spartacus. I got it recommended for one of the questions that I had asked in regards to whether or not the Western Allies would have started a Western Front invasion if the USSR was losing or collapsing. And so I'm going to look at a video that goes into that, and it'll be out later today. Also, the channel has been growing pretty quickly, and I'm very appreciative of all the views and all the comments. If you would help me or like to help me keep it growing, hit the like button and comment and subscribe and all of that. It helps me kind of grace the algorithm in my favor. And so all of that is greatly appreciated. It helps me keep building the channel and the community over here. With all that being said, let's get into it. Eastory's World War II animated Western Front, 1940.
1939, Germany found itself in a war with Britain and France. At that time, the strength of the sides was similar, but the Allies had a significant long-term advantage and in the following years could field a much stronger army. Germany's only chance for victory was to defeat the Allies as soon as possible. It set out for an all-out attack. This video is sponsored by War Thunder. More on that later. For the Western campaign, the Germans had less than 3 million men in 135 divisions. France had 2,200,000 men in 104 divisions. They were supported by the British Expeditionary Force with a size of 500,000 men. This made the Allied and the German forces roughly equal. France had prepared to defend its borders. Its southern flank was covered by the Rhine River and the Vosges Hills and needed few additional defenses. Further north, the Franco-German border didn't have the benefit of natural obstacles. Here, the French had built the strongest defenses on the Maginot Line, which was held by significant forces. The mobile divisions of the French army and the British forces were on the Franco-Belgian border. They could be used to hold the northern part of the French border or to reinforce the Maginot Line or the Belgian army if Germany was to invade.
Yeah, so the thought process here obviously is a repeat of World War I, right? The Germans are going to come through Belgian territory in order to kind of sidestep the stronger parts of the Maginot Line. And so the French and British are going to have strong, quick units ready at the back of Belgian territory in order to hold them off or come in and help the Belgians. They were very careful, though. They did not want to. This was a huge deal to the French and British. They did not want to step foot on Belgian territory before the Germans did. So if they were very careful about keeping their troops back, making sure nobody was going to accidentally wander their way into Belgium before the Germans did.
The French had more tanks than the Germans, but they had dispersed many of them among their infantry and could only field 3 tank and 3 light mechanized divisions. The Germans had deployed their tanks in single units and had 10 tank divisions at hand.
It's a big deal.
The Germans wanted to use this as the core element of their plan. At first, they would invade the Low Countries. This would have the Allies to commit their forces to Belgium, so they were not able to counter the real German attack in the south. The main German tank force would move through the Ardennes region and break through at the weakest part of the French defenses, then extend the offensive towards the coast and cut off the Allied forces. In order to move into the Low Countries, Germany would have to pass through their defensive lines. Germany exploited the fact that these nations were not at war and had therefore not fully manned their defenses. They were able to launch an airborne assault and capture a section of both Dutch and Belgian lines. Now the paratroopers had to hold out until they would be reinforced by the land forces. Learning of the German invasion, the Allies now had to decide how to intervene in Belgium. They could move part of their forces into western Belgium, or they could deploy most of them in the central part of the country. They wanted to give Belgium maximum assistance and went for the latter. They also sent part of the troops to help the Netherlands, fully deploying their forces. In Belgium, the Germans were able to link up with their airborne troops. With Belgian defenses breached, the Belgian army began pulling back to central Belgium. In the north, the Germans advanced into the gap between the Belgian and the Dutch defenses and linked up with the paratroopers holding part of the Dutch line. This allowed them to move part of the tank forces behind the Dutch main line. When the Germans threatened to launch a terror bombing campaign against the Dutch cities, the Netherlands surrendered. At the same time,
They actually did bomb one of those cities after the surrender technically, but it was a whole cluster. But yeah, they ended up bombing one of the cities there. Also, this is perfect for Germany, right? They get if they were having their main force go through Belgium like in World War I, this would have been the correct response by the Allies. You send them in, you man the defensive line in the middle of Belgium so that Belgium doesn't get overrun, and you put the stop to it right there. Because this is not the main part of the attack, it ends up being a mistake as far as, strategic outlines go. This is what the Germans were hoping for, because they want all of their troops engaged further north, and then there's there to be no reserves, and then they're going to essentially make a breakneck, hit through the middle of the line, cut the two off, cut their communications, and then go all the way through and trap them at the coast. That's the move. In order to have that be successful, you have to have the Allies engage those troops that could be reserve troops. That's what they do.
tank divisions further south had overrun Luxembourg and pushed aside the Allied screening units. Soon they reached the prepared French defensive lines. The Germans launched a massive aerial bombardment. The French second-rate divisions could not withstand the attack by the best German units, and the Germans were able to breach the defenses. The French thought that the Germans wanted to outflank the main body of the Maginot Line by moving south and concentrated on that direction. Seeing that the French western flank was barely covered, the German tank commanders took a risk and moved forward without waiting for their infantry. The Allies were surprised by the German breakthrough, but they now knew that this was the main German attack. They began redeploying their reserves to that area. At the same time, they ordered the troops in Belgium to fall back in order to put them into a better position and free up some divisions. The Allies did not know whether the Germans were moving towards Paris or the Channel coast and had to cover both directions. For that, they could use the 3 tank divisions located in the area. But the question was, where should they make the stand? The French believed that the German tanks will wait for their infantry to consolidate and therefore won't be moving very fast.
That plays such a huge role in the outcome of this, right? I'm so glad he talked about that, because that is such a massive, massive part of the Allies being on the back foot and the Germans having the success that they have ultimately on the Western Front early in the war. And that is the thought process of war at this time, of how to prosecute a war, is that the tanks are there kind of as like they're there to work in tandem with infantry, right? Like the thought process was not that they couldn't be successful at all, but that to really utilize them in the way that they could be utilized, they had to work with infantry, move with infantry, and that's why there's a lot of French units that have infantry actually in with the tanks, right? Because the thought process is that's how tank warfare works. And they have to be with the infantry to work well. They have to have the backing of the supplies and the ground troops in order to really be effective in war. And this is the part of the war where the German tank generals are really going to hold their own, right? Like this is where some of the big tank general names of the war come from, is from this initial thrust here. And it's because everything is happening extremely quickly. And the idea of how tanks are used in war is basically crumbled and thrown away by the German military hierarchy. They are not interested in it. They want the tanks to act independently, not exclusively independently, but much more independently than the Western Allies are thinking. They want them to act independently. They want them to move quickly, to pierce enemy lines, to force movement by the enemy in a direction that they want the overall battle to move in. And so that's what they do. So there's this expectation that the tanks will move as quickly as their infantry troops can move with them. And the German tank divisions are like, no, hell no. We can move as fast as a freaking tank can move. And in fact, we can move as fast as a tank can move 24 hours a day, on our speed pills. And so, yeah, it's just they totally catch the Allies off guard with the way that their tanks work and the quick movement of this type of war that Germany is now kind of bringing onto the world stage.
As a result, they believed that they had the time to prepare defensive positions on the Oise River. The German command had indeed ordered their tanks to slow down, but the German tank commanders had ignored the orders and continued to advance. They moved much faster than the French had expected, and the Germans encountered the French units as they were still assembling. This caught the 1st French Armored Division off guard, and it was destroyed, while the 2nd Division was dispersed and overrun. The 4th Tank Division was not on the main axis of the German advance and was able to cover the assembly of the French troops on the Paris direction. The German tanks now needed for their infantry and supplies to catch up. As a result, the advance of the German tanks slowed down, and in the following days they were able to take only limited territory. The Allies were in the process of finishing their withdrawal in Belgium, and they were able to deploy troops to cover the Paris direction. But they hadn't had the time to put their troops between the Germans and the Channel. They decided that their best hope was to attack the German spearhead from two sides and encircle it. However, their light mechanized divisions were still pinned down on the front, and with 2 of their tank divisions destroyed, they lacked the sufficient strength. As a result, the Allies were only able to undertake limited counterattacks. First one was by the 4th Tank Division, but it didn't have much effect.
So this is the danger of this type of warfare from the Germans, right? And in fact, there's a quote by Winston Churchill where he says something to the effect of, the turtle has stuck its head too far out from the shell. The meaning of this and the way that you attack this is that your counterattacks are going to cut off the exposed units that have gone too far ahead, right? So they have it set up there where there is this bulge in the line where the tank units have pushed through, but there's not much as far as guarding the flanks because of how far they've pushed so quickly. So the way that you attack that is you have one group from each side come down and meet each other, and you're going to cut off those tank units from their supplies and from their infantry. But you have to have the sufficient power in order to do it. This is one of the things that Germany struggles with once they lose their access to oil and their ability to use their motorized and tank divisions the way that they want to on the Eastern Front. they get into a position where they can no longer expose or cut off the exposed parts of the line that have pushed too far too quickly. If you don't have the strength to cut it off, then there really isn't a whole lot of downside to this from the Germans' viewpoint, because all you have is the speed. You don't really have to worry about having your lines cut and things like that if the enemy doesn't have the speed and manpower in order to make that happen.
Meanwhile, the Germans had consolidated their lines and finished the resupply. They resumed the offensive in full strength, and with little Allied troops to cover the general direction, they soon reached the sea. The Allies launched an attack at Arras, but it was only of limited success. The Germans turned north with the intention of capturing the Channel ports and cutting the Allies off from their supply lines. This move threatened the Allied units with outflanking, and they had to send many of the units they had carried for the counterattack to extend the flanks north. As a result, their northern force was unable to launch the counterattack. At the same time, their forces in the south held their positions to have a chance to link up with the possible counterattack from the main French lines.
Really, they're kind of lucky here. I had never really noticed this until seeing it, on a map and on screen here. They're really kind of lucky that the German panzer units are moving so quickly that they're kind of just going place to place, and the where they're going and how they're moving and what they're cutting off is kind of changing rapidly, because they could do the exact same thing here that was threatened with them, with their bulk of their tank divisions exposed just a minute ago, where if a few of those tank divisions cut up towards Belgium here, and the divisions that are across and in Belgium cut in, they could basically cut off the entire army of the North, British and French, before they even get to the Channel. The only northern resistance left would be the Belgian army, and the Belgian army isn't gonna, So that's very interesting. That's a very dangerous situation where they have that bulge now coming out with the French and British troops, because they haven't moved back quickly enough to the coastline.
The Germans ordered their units in the west of the pocket on defensive to meet the possible Allied breakout attempt. The French were deploying forces for an attack from the south, but as more of German infantry arrived to the sector, they needed more troops. But with the troops in the north without access to supply and being threatened with encirclement, it was impossible to wait any longer. Therefore, it was decided to evacuate the troops. They could attempt to break out or be pulled out by sea.
Do you see that? See the 61-7 right there, but with the German troops on one side of the line and the Belgian troops on the other, it's slowly moving in behind the British and French troops. That's where I'm talking about. Where, like, if they made a quick dash there, they might have been able to get them.
As the Allies had become too weak to attempt a breakout, it was decided to pull their troops out of the ports still under their control. The Allies began the retreat to the sea. The Germans attempted to break their lines and cut off part of their forces. As the Allied forces were leaving, the Belgian army was unable to resist the Germans on its own and surrendered. The Germans were able to cut off and encircle part of the French forces. Other troops managed to hold a solid front, reached the sea, and proceeded with the evacuation. The Germans pulled most of their forces back and started to prepare for their second attack on France. More than 300,000 Allied soldiers were able to be evacuated, but all of their equipment was lost. As the Allies weren't able to replace it in time, most of these soldiers didn't take part in the next phase of the Battle of France. Now the Germans outnumbered the French. The French were holding the positions on the Somme and Eun rivers. However, the Germans had established several bridgeheads which weakened the defense. To overcome that, the French could pull the main forces back to the next river line around Paris, but they decided against it. The French wanted to use the defensive advantage provided by the rivers in northern France to inflict significant casualties on the advancing German army in the hope that it would run out of steam. In order to do
You better figure out a way to stop those panzers. because if not, you're gonna be in the same situation again.
To do that, the French needed to avoid the breakthrough by the German tanks at all costs.
Yeah.
The Germans did not want to give France any time to recover, and as soon as part of their forces got ready, they attacked. At first, the French plan worked, and they were able to fall back in an organized manner, but soon the first breakthrough happened. The German tanks broke through the French lines and reached the river Seine. The French were able to destroy the breaches and block their advance. But the German tanks now moved towards the sea and cut off part of the Allied forces. By then, the other part of the German forces had joined the attack. The French were able to slowly pull back, but eventually the German tanks were able to break through. The French troops west of Paris had been encircled and destroyed, and as a result, the Germans were able to cross the Seine unopposed, and the French lacked the troops to contain them. The French command was afraid that now their troops were going to be encircled, and ordered them to break contact with the Germans and move further south to make a stand on the Loire River.
Those German tanks are so damn fast. It's incredible. I keep keeping my eye up on the upper right hand corner where it has the date, because the length that they're moving daily is just absurd. And it's crazy to watch it on a map how far they're actually moving. And this is the situation where, if you're France, what do you do here? Like, you're basically in a fight for your life, and you don't have time to even catch your footing. You're just continuously moving further and further and further back, and you're trying to do it so quickly that it's impossible to really put up, the kind of resistance that you need. But also, if you stop and try to put up that resistance, there could be a couple of panzer units that break through, and then your whole army is going to be encircled. It's just it's a brutal situation for the French.
The defense of Paris was abandoned, but the withdrawal broke the cohesion of the French armies, and the German tanks were able to fully break through into the French rear. Germany wanted not to allow the French forces to escape, and attempted to cut off and destroy as much of them as possible. With most of the French army moving on foot, the tanks could easily outmaneuver them. They pushed deep into the French rear, and many of the French units were caught or bypassed and dispersed. With most of the French army in the west in retreat, the largest portion of intact French forces were behind the Maginot Line. They had pulled a lot of the forces off from line into field divisions, which could pose a threat to Germans. The Germans set out to destroy them. They attempted to overwhelm the French defenders by attack from all directions. Their main force would move in from the west, while the tanks outflanked the line from the south. At the same time, they launched attacks through the weakened line from north and east. Meanwhile, the French had reached the Loire River in force and attempted to make a stand. However, they were unable to cover all the crossings, and on the same day, the pursuing German forces crossed the river. The French continued the retreat. At the same time, the German tanks overran the French forces retreating in the north. The French in the east were unable to form a solid front against the German offensive from several directions, and the Germans were able to encircle them and push them into a small pocket, making them surrender.
They're just too fast. They're too fast. Even the line that they were going to try to quickly form at the river, they were already outflanked by tank units. There were tank units that were already so far past their position, a little bit further south than that it wouldn't have made any sense. The tanks could have come right around and cut them off.
Only a small part of the French forces was able to survive the retreat, and the odds had become too unfavorable to continue the war. Although the French were successfully resisting attempts by Italy to cross the Alps, they were unable to resist Germany.
Freaking Italy, man. That's going to be a common theme in this war, is Italy struggling on an offensive.
They agreed to German terms and signed the armistice, which would come into effect 2 days later. There were several reasons why France lost the campaign, but lacking good tanks was not one of them. While the lighter French tanks did not perform too well, their heavy Char P2 breakthrough tanks and Samoa S-35 cruiser tanks were more than a match for the Germans. large part of the German victory was that they managed to outmaneuver the French armor on operational level. If you're wondering how the French tanks would have done on a more equal playing field, check out War Thunder.
Yeah, so we'll get into this more in a future video, but the rap that the French troops get in this war, I think, is almost wholly undeserved. They are left out to dry, essentially, by their leadership. Decisions are not being made quickly enough. When they are being made, they're not seeing the reality of the strategic and tactical situation on the ground. It's just brutal. There's a ton of mistakes made by the French military hierarchy, and the soldiers basically end up taking the historical rap for them, right? But yeah, they in my opinion, they get a totally bad rap. This was not anything to do with the French soldiers' ability or lack thereof to fight. It had nothing to do with that. But with all that being said, that was the first video of Eastory's Western Front 1940. Like, comment, subscribe. Help me keep building the channel over here. I will have another video out in a couple hours after now, the World War II Channel 1, and I will see you guys then.